What kind of courage does it take for a woman to run into a winter storm knowing she might die, yet still believing it is safer than staying with her own husband? The cold barrel of a revolver had pressed against Marlene Winfield's temple just hours before. Edgar's teeth were clenched as he whispered his warning in the dim candlelight of their isolated Montana cabin. His eyes held nothing human in them anymore, only a dark emptiness that had grown over the 3 years of their marriage. Marlene's hands had shaken as she nodded, unable to speak through the tight fear choking her. This wasn't the first time he had threatened her, but something in his voice told her it might be the last warning she would ever hear. When he finally stomped out to the barn, leaving her alone with the flickering shadows and her racing heartbeat, she knew she had to escape. At 18, she had believed Edgar's promises of adventure and prosperity. Her parents had encouraged the marriage, thinking she'd be safe. They never saw how Edgar changed once she was isolated, far from everyone she knew. On that lonesome Montana homestead, his true nature crawled out like a rattlesnake from a dark hole. Tonight would be her only chance. At dawn, Edgar left for Helena as he always did, a 3-day ride. She watched him ride down the trail, forcing her face to stay calm though her heart hammered in her chest. The very second he disappeared from sight, Marlene rushed inside. She gathered what she had hidden for months, a small bundle of clothing, her mother's cameo brooch, and the few coins she had saved. She dressed in her warmest layers, pinned up her honey-brown hair, tied her sturdy boots, and stepped out into the freezing November morning. The air stung her lungs, but she welcomed it. Freedom, even cold freedom, was better than Edgar's hands ever touching her again. Silver Creek lay almost 30 miles south. If she followed the creek and kept a steady pace, she thought she could reach it in 2 or 3 days. Maybe she could find work. Maybe she could start over. Maybe she could simply survive. For hours she walked, pushing through the cold wind as snow clouds gathered on the darkening horizon. By midday she had covered good ground, but the wind grew sharper, tearing through her thin gloves. She pushed on anyway, stopping only to drink from the icy creek and chew a hard biscuit. By late afternoon, snowflakes began to spin through the air. The temperature dropped quickly, the sky growing darker by the minute. Marlene's fingers stiffened, her legs grew heavier, and her breath came in painful puffs. Panic slowly crept in. If she didn't find shelter, the storm would swallow her. She whispered to herself, just a little farther, though she didn't know how much farther she could go. The wind whipped the snow into her eyes as she stumbled blindly forward. Just when the fear of dying alone in the wilderness began to squeeze her chest, she saw a dark shape ahead. Squinting through the storm, she realized it wasn't a rock. It was an old miner's shack leaning against a rocky hillside. Barely able to stand, she pushed through the broken door and collapsed inside. The shack was cold, drafty, and smelled of damp earth, but it was shelter. She curled into a corner, wrapping her arms tightly around herself. Her teeth chattered. Her limbs grew heavy. Sleep tugged at her hard. Dangerous, deadly sleep. Stay awake, she whispered, though she could hardly feel her lips. Outside, the storm screamed against the wooden boards. The cold seeped deeper and deeper into her bones. Her eyes slipped closed. Then, footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps crunching through snow. A horse snorted. Marlene's fear jolted her awake. Had Edgar found her so soon? Her heart raced as the shack door flew open with a blast of wind and swirling snow. A tall figure filled the doorway, broad-shouldered, wrapped in a thick sheepskin coat and a snow-covered hat. A lantern lit his face from below, revealing strong features and calm blue eyes. "Hello?" he called into the darkness. "Is someone in here?" Marlene tried to answer, but her voice barely worked. Only a soft sound escaped. The stranger stepped inside, his expression changing to shock and concern when he saw her. He dropped to his knees beside her. "Good Lord," he muttered gently, "you're half frozen." He shrugged out of his heavy coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. Then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a thick wool blanket, tucking it carefully around her as if she were glass. "My name's Samuel Blackwood," he said, voice steady and warm despite the cold air. "I've got a cabin not far from here. Can you stand?" she managed a weak nod. In one smooth motion, he lifted her into his arms, blanket and all, and carried her out into the storm. The horse stood waiting, snow piling on its back. Samuel placed her carefully on the saddle and climbed up behind her. His arms came around her, strong and protective, shielding her from the brutal wind. "Hold on," he said. "I've got you." Marlene leaned into his warmth, her strength slipping, her eyes closing. The last thing she felt as they rode through the blizzard was the steady heartbeat of the cowboy who held her. Steady, warm, strong. She did not know it yet, but this night would change her life forever. How does a woman learn to breathe again after years of fear? How does she trust warmth when life has only taught her cold? Marlene woke to the soft crackling of a fire and the deep, comforting scent of pine. For a moment she didn't know where she was. The blanket around her was warm. The bed beneath her was soft. Sunlight filtered through a window she didn't recognize. Slowly, the memories returned. The storm, the abandoned shack, and the strong arms of the man who had carried her through the blizzard. Samuel Blackwood. She pushed herself upright, wincing at the soreness in her limbs. Her boots had been placed neatly by the fire. Her clothes hung near the hearth, dry now. The cabin was small but warm, with sturdy wooden walls and a steady fire glowing in the stone hearth. A pot simmered on the stove, filling the room with a smell that made her stomach growl. The door opened, and Samuel stepped inside, carrying an armload of firewood. Snow dusted his coat and hat. His eyes softened when he saw her awake. "Good morning," he said. "How are you feeling?" Quote, "Better," Marlene whispered, pulling the wool blanket tighter around her. "Sore, but better. Thank you for everything." "You don't owe me thanks," Samuel replied. "Anyone would have helped." But his tone said not everyone would have. He set the firewood down and moved to the stove, filling 2 bowls with warm porridge. When he handed one to her, the kindness nearly brought tears to her eyes. No man had served her a meal before, not without anger in his hands. She took a bite, letting the warmth spread through her chest. "You mentioned Silver Creek last night," Samuel said as he sat across from her. "Is that where you were headed?" Marlene nodded. "I was trying to outrun my husband." Samuel's expression darkened slightly as he looked at the fading bruise along her jaw, a bruise she had hoped was hidden. "Is he the reason you were freezing to death in a storm?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she whispered. He wouldn't let me leave. I waited until he was gone and ran." Samuel didn't press for details, but she could see understanding in his eyes. Deep, quiet understanding. "You're safe here," he said gently. "You can stay till the storm clears." The word struck her harder than she expected. Safe. She hadn't felt that word in years. The next days passed in a peaceful rhythm. Snow piled high outside the cabin, cutting them off from the world. But inside there was warmth. A kind of warmth Marlene had forgotten existed. Samuel checked his trap lines each morning, returning with snow on his coat and a smile on his face. Marlene cooked meals, mended clothes, and kept the fire strong. She found herself laughing. Small laughs at first, then bigger ones. Samuel had a quiet humor, unexpected but welcome. He never raised his voice, never slammed a door, never made her feel small. For the first time since she was 18, she could breathe. But peace never lasts long for a woman running from fear. One afternoon, Samuel returned early. Snow dusted his shoulders, but his expression was tense. "Someone's been asking about you in Silver Creek," he said, shutting the door behind him. The bowl Marlene held slipped from her fingers and clattered to the table. "Who?" Quote, "Your husband," Samuel said. "Jim Peterson saw him in town. Edgar's offering money for information. He told people his wife ran away and he's trying to bring her home." Panic shot through her. "He'll find me. He always finds me." Samuel stepped forward, calm but firm. "He doesn't know you're here, and he won't get you back. Not while I'm breathing." The certainty in his voice steadied her, but the fear remained coiled in her stomach. She knew Edgar's rage, his threats, his cruelty, and he would never accept losing control. Over the next weeks, Marlene regained her strength. The snow melted slowly. Samuel taught her how to shoot his spare revolver, guiding her hands with gentle patience. She learned to aim, to steady her breath, to protect herself, something Edgar never allowed. They grew closer, not through force or fear, but through shared days and quiet nights. Samuel listened to her dreams of owning a dressmaking shop. He told her stories of his childhood in Pennsylvania, and slowly, without realizing when it began, Marlene began to trust him, not just with her safety, but with her heart. Then, one bitter February afternoon, everything changed. Marlene was alone in the cabin, kneading dough for fresh bread, when she heard distant hoofbeats, not from the north, where Samuel always returned from, but from the main trail to the east. Her blood ran cold. She moved to the window, keeping herself hidden behind the curtain. A lone rider approached through the snow patches, the rigid posture, the familiar horse, the dark coat. Edgar. Her heart hammered so loudly she feared he would hear it. She grabbed the revolver Samuel had taught her to use and stepped back from the door. Her hands shook, but she didn't run. Not this time. 3 hard knocks shook the cabin door. "Hello, the cabin!" Edgar shouted. "Anyone home?" Quote. Silence. "I can smell bread," he growled. "Open the door." Another knock, harder this time. Then his voice changed, sharp and furious. "Marlene, I know you're in there. Open this door before I break it down." Quote. She raised the gun, aiming at chest height. "I am armed, Edgar," she said, voice trembling but strong. "Step back." He answered with a cruel laugh. "You won't shoot me. You never had the courage." The next hit splintered the top hinge. The door wouldn't hold much longer. Her finger tightened on the trigger. And then, hoofbeats thundered across the yard. Samuel's voice rang out like steel cutting through the cold air. "Step away from that door and show your hands!" Marlene exhaled a shaky breath. Samuel had come home. Edgar spun in fury outside, shouting something she couldn't make out. 2 men, one from her past filled with terror, and one from her present filled with hope, now stood inches from each other. "Back away, Winfield," Samuel ordered. "The lady doesn't want to go with you." "She's my wife," Edgar roared, "and the law is on my side." "She's a woman, not property. And she leaves when she wants." Silence fell thick as the cold air between them. Then Edgar spat. "This isn't over." He mounted his horse and rode off, snow spraying beneath the hooves. Marlene sank to her knees as Samuel burst through the broken door. He knelt beside her, taking the trembling gun from her hand. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, tears spilling. "No," she whispered, "but he'll be back." Samuel pulled her into his arms, holding her close against his chest. "Then we'll be ready." Because for the first time in years, she wasn't facing fear alone. What does freedom feel like to a woman who has never tasted it? And what kind of love grows from the courage it takes to fight for it? The next morning, the cabin felt different, not because of the broken door, but because of the truth Marlene could no longer ignore. Edgar had found her once. He would try again. And she was tired of running. Samuel fixed the damaged hinge before dawn, working quietly while Marlene wrapped her shawl around her trembling shoulders. When he was done, he turned to her with steady eyes. "We can't just wait for him to come back," he said. "You deserve more than fear." For the first time, Marlene met his gaze without looking away. "I know." Quote. Samuel stepped closer, his voice softer. "There's a judge coming to Silver Creek next month. If we gather witnesses and stand together, you could get a divorce. A legal one. One that would cut Edgar's hold on you forever." The word divorce felt heavy, dangerous, but also full of hope. "No woman has ever helped me," Marlene whispered. "No one believed me before." "People believe you now," Samuel said. "You aren't alone." And for the first time since she had fled into the storm, she knew it was true. Days turned into weeks. Winter's grip loosened. Snow melted from the mountains, and soft patches of grass began to break through. Samuel rode to the neighbors, gathering their support. Martha Peterson promised to testify. So did Jacob Reese, who had witnessed Edgar's cruelty toward a ranch hand. Even the widow Collins said she would speak up. A community was forming around Marlene, a circle she never imagined would stand for her. Finally, the day arrived. They rode into Silver Creek side by side. Marlene wore a simple forest green dress borrowed from Martha, her hair braided neatly. Samuel walked beside her, quiet but strong. In the courthouse, really a large room above the general store, the townsfolk filled every seat. Edgar was already there. Even across the room, his eyes found her like a predator spotting prey. But this time, his stare no longer froze her blood. She felt Samuel's calm presence behind her, and her shoulders lifted higher. Judge Calloway called the case forward. What followed was the hardest hour of Marlene's life. She told the court about the years of fear, the isolation, the threats. The night the gun pressed into her skin. Her voice shook, but she did not stop speaking. Mr. Grant, Edgar's lawyer, tried to twist her words, tried to imply she was unstable or dramatic, tried to paint Edgar as the victim. But then, Samuel stepped forward. He told them how he found her half frozen in the storm. He described her bruises, her terror, her desperation to survive. His voice never rose. He didn't exaggerate. The simple truth was enough. Witness after witness came forward. Martha, Jacob, widow Collins, all confirming Edgar's known violence, his bad temper, his cruel behavior. By the time Edgar took the stand, the room was no longer on his side. He tried to charm the judge, claiming Marlene was, quote, overly sensitive and imagined trouble where there was none. But when the judge asked about the revolver, Edgar snapped. A man has the right to teach his wife, he barked. That's the law. A wave of disgust rippled through the room. Judge Calloway's face hardened. Threatening your wife's life is not the law, Mr. Winfield. It is cruelty. Everything went still. Then the judge lifted his gavel. The petition for divorce is granted. Marlene's breath left her in one long, shaking exhale. The world blurred as tears filled her eyes. Not from pain, but from relief so deep it felt like sunlight warming frozen ground. You are free, the judge continued. From this day forward. Edgar exploded with fury, but the sheriff stepped between them before he could approach her. The law was now on Marlene's side, not his. When Marlene stepped out of the courthouse, Samuel was waiting at the bottom of the stairs. She paused, snow melt dripping from the rooftops around them, and took a long breath of cold, clean air. How do you feel? Samuel asked quietly. Marlene looked at him, really looked at him. The man who carried her through a storm, the man who fixed every broken thing without asking for anything in return. The man who taught her she didn't have to live in fear. Lighter, she whispered. Free. A small smile touched Samuel's lips. So, what now? Marlene didn't hesitate. I want to go home. He blinked. To the cabin? To you, she said softly. Samuel's hand covered hers, warm and steady. Then let's go home. And so they returned to the mountains, not as frightened strangers thrown together by fate, but as two souls choosing each other freely. Spring spread across Montana like an awakening. Flowers bloomed, rivers thawed, and Marlene began to build the life she once thought she'd never have. She opened a small sewing corner in Silver Creek that soon grew into a real shop. Samuel expanded the cabin, adding a second room for her sewing. They learned to laugh together, to dream together, to build a future together. Months passed, and one warm afternoon under the tall pine tree near their home, Samuel took her hand. I'd like to court you proper, he said with a shy smile. If that's something you want. Marlene felt her heart bloom like the wildflowers around them. I'd like that very much. Their courtship was gentle and sweet. Walks through the valley, evenings by the fire, small gifts made with rough, loving hands. The man who had once wrapped her in a blanket now wrapped her in a life she had never dared imagine. Finally, in early autumn, with golden leaves swirling around them, they married under the same pine tree where Samuel had first spoken his heart. Marlene walked toward him in an ivory dress she sewed herself. Samuel waited with tears in his eyes, wearing the shirt she'd stitched for him months ago. Friends and neighbors filled the clearing. Pastor Williams blessed their union. And when Samuel kissed her, it wasn't a claim of ownership. It was a promise, one built on trust, tenderness, and a love that had grown slowly, carefully, beautifully. Years later, when their daughter Hope was born, Samuel held the tiny infant close and whispered, "You were born from courage, little one, from your mama's brave heart." As Marlene watched him cradle their baby, she felt something settle in her chest, a peace she had never known, a peace she had fought for. The blanket Samuel had wrapped around her that first night had saved her from the cold, but his love saved her life. Forever.